So welcome to the Feria TechCast, where we'll bring you all things science, engineering, technology, and innovation. Today we are joined by Daniel Tausan, a stem cell biologist and the founder of Timeline Science, who bridges the gap between molecular science and personal wellness. With a graduate degree in stem cell biology from the University of British Columbia, Daniel has researched molecular profiling of exercise and biological age calculation. His personal journey with asthma, allergies, and gastrointestinal challenges fueled his passion to make cutting-edge biological knowledge accessible and actionable for everyone. Today, we'll explore the pillars of longevity, how genetics shape our health, what blood can reveal about our well-being, and how stem cells function in regeneration. So Daniel, welcome to the show.
Ezekiel, it's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, so tell us, Daniel, what is science today?
That's a great question. It's starting to go towards a religion. People are believing in science rather than knowing the science. And I think that's an important distinction. You don't believe in your parents. You don't believe in your eye color. You know these things. And that's what science is. It's something in which is supposed to be a conversation. It's supposed to be observable, measurable, and then predictable. When we get into this era of, hey, trust me, I'm not going to disclose what I'm doing, but you just need trust. We're getting into very dangerous territory. And so this is why I think it's very important for the everyday man to know that science is a tool. It's a way of thinking, right? We often use the word improperly. When we say like, we'll use the word in place of a scientific institute or a place that does some kind of business. We'll say, oh, they're doing science over there. And it's okay as a placeholder. For example, people will say, science hasn't yet realized. That's fine. I understand what the person is saying, but that's not grammatically correct. In order to have a realization, you need to have a nervous system, you need to have memories, you need to have a brain of some sort in order to have a realization. So science can't realize anything. It's not an entity like that. And we do this very, very much so, I think, in a purposeful way within, I would say, within the field, right? If you're in the back end producing the science, you understand that you're trying to scoop together data and put it together into a story. That's what you call it when you want to publish something. You call it a story. And there's a big gap, I think, that's occurring, and it's growing larger and larger for the everyday individual to be able to connect with what's really going on in the back end. Lipid nanoparticles, mRNA. It's getting further and further away to understand really what's being exposed or given to us. And so I think it's very important to come back to the basics to know how to ask, okay, well, what are you observing? What are you measuring? What are you predicting? Because those questions will stay fundamentally the same. And that's the heart, that's the root or framework for science. And when you do improper comparisons, when you compare apples to oranges, as they say within the community, you can make a lot of things seem as if they are valuable. A drug is all of a sudden super effective, but you just played around with statistics. You compared, apples to oranges instead of the proper groups. If you want to look at longevity, you don't take the guy who's living to, past 100 and compare him to someone who's dying at 60 of, cardiovascular or Alzheimer's or whatever. You have to do those fair comparisons in order to get meaning. And biology is a science that is very difficult because there is massive variation from person to person. Even within your own kin, even brothers and sisters, they can have massive variation, and that should be the closest, call it genetic, comparison on planet Earth. So it makes it challenging in that regard, but also makes it beautiful so that, there's work for us biologists for years to come.
Wonderful. So tell us, how do we separate science from story?
Well, I alluded to a little bit of that with saying observe, measure, and predict. And so if I was to give a task, to give you a article or listen to someone speak and say, okay, well, separate out all the science there that's going to last, that'll last the centuries, that'll last the ages. What is it that you would pull out? Well, you would pull out, for example, things that are, okay, well, what what age group did the person look at? Okay. How many characteristics did they write down for those people? Their height, their weight, their uh, breath retention, their speed, their lifting, their what kind of attributes were they able to capture? And we do a little bit, but even from study to study, let's say in exercise physiology, sometimes I wish they did a little better comprehensive characterization so that I can say, hey, group from this, one study has, better or worse outcomes because of the group from the other study because they did something different. But if you didn't characterize, if you didn't observe and write down things to a certain point, you can't compare between them. So the observation is the first part, and if you get it wrong, there's no moving forward. You can't do anything else. It's like starting a skyscraper and your first two floors are tilted at an angle, right? The more you try to build, it's going to tip over. The second part is the part that is very tedious, what most people consider the work that no one really wants to look at. So when I produce figures and I'd come up with all this, you know, anxiety of having to count cells under a microscope to say, okay, there's this many cells. But, if I just shifted the field of view ever so slightly, I could get a different number. So whatever, I put something down and it's reflective of, the majority of what I see. And I have a great deal of anxiety over it because I want to make sure I'm communicating, to call it as best I can, what I'm observing in this, experiment. And lo and behold, no one really cares. They just see the graph and they take that as face value as if it is to a T or it is like the spoken word. And so this level of measurement is difficult, right? It's the part that starts becoming harder and harder to communicate with, but it's still an important aspect to have at least some faith. This is where the trust comes in, that the person can do their technique appropriately. And once people have done it, whatever a human being does, whatever they practice, they get better at. So what do I mean? Well, you can cut a microscope slide, you can cut it, 3 microns or 5 microns. It seems like not a big deal, but it's going to be a whole boatload of, different measurement, different graphs you can end up. So, is the person good at their craft? You'd hope so. And sometimes that's clearly the case where it's poor quality work. And that's why we have an era where you have 40 to 60% of things that are not replicable. You can't publish again. You can't get the same results because, the quality of science is low. And then the last part is that you're trying to get to some kind of understanding of the world, no matter what science you're doing, whether you're looking at mushrooms in the forest or you're trying to build out, propulsion systems, whatever it is. At the end, you come up with a model of how your system functions or your idea or whatnot functions. And so in that predictive portion, that's sort of the gift to the rest of, the work. That's the goal at the end of the road for science, is that you come to a point where you're able to predict outcomes because you've studied and mapped out, call it the system, the model, to such an extent where you're getting closer and closer to approximating, 100%. But, most models will account for 70. That's still very good. And so when people say hypothesis, when you hear the word hypothesis in the greater scheme of things, it's often referring to this model, right? So you observe something, you write stuff down, you measure it, you do a bunch of experiments, and then you come up, okay, now I have an understanding of what's going on. I'm going to create a working model to be able to share so people can understand, okay, the human being, we have 2 energy systems, really. We have carbohydrates and fats. And that explains the majority of our energy systems. And then we have, under real special circumstances, we'll burn protein or oxidize protein, but that's not really part of the main energy systems that are occurring for, 99% of the day or 99% of people for the majority of the time. And so that's our model. That's our best working understanding of it. And you can do any one portion. If you just go to the woods and say, what mushrooms are growing in my woods? Well, that's observational science, and that's good enough. You can leave it there. Someone else can come and pick up and do, carry from your work. And I think that's a very important thing to understand. It's like, what can you actually pick up from that piece of literature and continue going forward? Can you separate out their nonsense statistics? Can you separate out their nonsense claims? And even if they're, let's just say, trying to make a guess, that's part of science. For example, lactic acid 100 years ago was taken out and it was considered what was making people sore. Now, today we have, more techniques, better instrumentation, different ways of approaching it. We realize, that's not the way that sore feeling after exercise, that's not what's causing it. Because you can do experiments now where you inject, purified lactic acid. Did it cause it to be sore? No. And other ways of going around of really restricting one variable. And so even though they were wrong 100 years ago about lactic acid being sore, their blood values aren't. Their blood values is the science. You can take the lactic acid blood values they pulled out of people 100 years ago, and you can say, has that concentration, that metabolite changed anyway across 100 years? Have we adapted out of it or into it in any kind of meaningful manner? And if you say, they looked at 26-year-olds. All right, well, let's look at 26-year-olds now. What did they come up as? And you see, that's the science that was left 100 years ago. That's still useful. It's useful to know where they drew their lactic acid from, what the concentrations were. That tells you something very important and where humanity's drifting in these, biological markers, we'll call them. And so the story was fun. The story was useful. It was a way to communicate what they were seeing. But you got to know how to separate the science from story in order to be able to move forward.
That was an awesome response. So, from my personal experience with biology, I mean, as a subject, as a course. So, although I did not later go on to major focus on biology, I have a background in engineering, but at high school, I used to do biology. And at some point, in high school, when we just say biology, we learn some concept, we learn some things about biology, but I noticed that as it progressed to higher level, from ordinary level to advanced level in biology, say when you get to university or PhD, uh, these tutors or the lecturers will then tell you you learned this concept in your high school or ordinary level biology, but that's not really true. You should discard it, and they will tell you something that's it's a bit different from what you actually thought you used to know from ordinary level or high school biology. So I like to know what actually causes this variation in the concept they teach. I'm not sure if it's the same from where you went to school. But I'm speaking personally from the way it was here while I was studying biology in Nigeria. You know, in concepts like mathematics or physics, once you learn something, kind of like just advances in that pattern to when you get to advanced level. Like, for example, differential calculus from high school is only just a bit different or more complex when you get to advanced level like university, when you start doing engineering maths and differential equations. So it's not really changing. They don't really tell us, okay, what you learned in high school is not really correct. So I'd like to know, why is it like that for biology and science?
That's a great question. And, it's an experience I think that most people have gone through no matter where you are in the world, because the progression in understanding is extremely rapid. And though concepts build on one another, we often give analogies or short versions of, let's say complicated matters in biology, because either we don't know the full extent, or it just hasn't trickled down in a well enough manner so that it can be communicated. So, you know, the equations, they're really a description of, let's say, force or power or whatever it is. They don't cease to they don't change. They're very much so you're able to build on them. Whereas in biology, there's for example, I remember when I was in high school, it's now over close to 2 decades. Um, there was no such thing as the ability to regrow new brain cells. Their neurogenesis wasn't a topic. But to be fair, it was a topic. It's just that it was extremely limited to professionals in the field that were going about, you know, trying to showcase that they see this as a possible, let's say hypothesis or possible model that they could then showcase to the world. And it wasn't until, sometime later that they had enough instrumentation to be able to show that. And so these ideas, unfortunately, they come across like science in our classrooms and whatnot, like, oh, you can't regrow new brain cells. And then later someone finds a model or a way to examine it and to say, no, look, I can light up this, brain cell in a fly. And look, when you damage it, part of the brain regrows. Not all of it, but some parts of the brain regrow. And then now I made a model in a mouse. Look, I can light it up. Oh, look, the mouse does the same thing. Well, what about a human being? Okay. Well, now we have ways to examine even a human being. And so there's this incredible complexity that comes into it, but also the techniques in which you're using change. So because the techniques change, it gives you a new window to reassess what was there before. And unfortunately, in terms of, in math is very nice. You can physically see it. You can follow the numbers. It's very, I would say, logic based. Uh, Biology, in a lot of sense, it's asking you to engage your visualization in your imagery, because DNA is, yes, it's a double helix structure, if blah, blah, blah. However, that double helix structure is wound in an unbelievably complicated manner. It doesn't just sit around open and exposed. It's coiled around very particular protein, and then it's smushed together and packaged, and then there's winding and unwinding. And so no one can show you a picture. Yes, people have made videos and whatnot, but those videos are just a rendition or visualization that someone else had. So when you're in biology, possibly the best thing to do is to preface that, the importance of trying to visualize these events, these processes on your own, because you're living them. This is your life experience and how you can bring it about. And this is something that's very meaningful, as it will prime the individual to engage their creativity and engage their abstract thinking, so that they can present something that maybe that none of us can see. And they can say, you know what, when we talk about breathing, when we talk about, acids, I can have sensations, or I see, this type of process happening. And when a person has those, let's say visualizations, well, if they're completely off base, we'll have an experiment to share with them and be like, well, no, we think you're wrong because we have these experiments, this little test tube, or these, cells in a dish or whatever. And if they say something that's very intriguing or new, it might completely shift the way we understand, let's say acidosis and alkaline, or it might shift the way we think about respiration. It might shift the way we think about, how the DNA is protected or how the DNA is repaired. So we have a long-winded answer there. Just, kind of say that it's very much so, not that it's a changing field in regards that there's massive overhauls. It's that there's a lot of assumptions that looked like science to begin with, that no one was able to communicate and say, hey, you know what, that teacher over there, yeah, he's just regurgitating what, was written in a textbook. And that textbook portion is the story. It's not science, because the science itself, it takes years in order to be able to get to a point where you can read and understand it. The entry level into biology is pretty daunting. Most people will complain, especially children, or young students, it's a lot of memorization. But that's only the case so you can speak the language, and, if you can't speak the language of, mitochondria, aerobic cellular respiration, oxidative phosphorylation, I'm just throwing out some buzzwords here, but, that's just a way to start now investigating what's going on. And so when people see that as like, oh, I have to memorize a lot, it's like, well, no, you get to see the world in a way in which explains how you have energy. How do you take the outside world and convert it into you? I eat, I eat oatmeal, or I eat eggs, and they turn into Daniel. You eat them, they turn into Ezekiel. There's a programming happening there. It's unbelievably complicated programming. You can take any biological matter, really. You'll see you have a pineapple. Pineapples don't grow here, but I can throw them in the woods, and there's an intelligence in nature. It's going to turn on and digest and break down that pineapple and reabsorb it into components of life for the rest of life around. And so in order to be able to move on how to be able to investigate that, there has to be an inquiry, an interest, a curiosity. And then if there is, the jargon, that memorization doesn't really exist. It's just more of like, okay, this is how I speak about these matters, because this is the fundamental process of life, fermentation, aerobic and anaerobic, right? Those are processes, and allowed me to understand life experience. And if you're really good at a particular skill of biology, you can make good liquor. And if you can make liquor, I'll tell you for sure, people will like to come around and have fun, because that's a skill you can share with others. So there's benefits in knowing the process of life.
That's a wonderful response. What caught my attention was when you talked about having to do lots of memorization in your early stages. Like I remember, for example, when I newly started taking biology classes, I used to struggle a lot in remembering the names of some concepts related to biology. Like, for example, DNA, I would have to memorize what DNA really means. Okay, deoxyribonucleic acid. I just have to get to memorize some words to actually be able to understand and explain the concept later. So, tell us, Daniel, you're the founder of Timeline Science. Tell us about Timeline Science and what you do there.
So there's mounting information within academic institutes, even within the medical fields, in which the everyday individual has a massive gap. You can get fancy tests about what's going on inside you. DNA companies, blood testing companies, and there's no middleman. If you want to go speak to somebody, you got to go onto their website or their hotline, or you got to try to track down a doctor that can accurately tell you something about maybe something he wasn't trained in and what they're not comfortable to talk about. And so I decided I'll be the middleman. I love the biology and I like working with people. The laboratory stuff is fine. I had, it was fun for the time being, but I enjoy coaching, interacting, uh, leading people firsthand to a better life. And so that is what timeline science is about. There's one timeline that we all share, and you use science to describe it. And that's exactly what I do with my services, with my business. I present to you what's right now out there as observable, measurable, predictable information to give you the best leg up so that all the noise, all the competing voices, if there's questions, if there's, hey, is this guy right? Is this guy right? I'm happy to put together, where their arguments are strongest and help you make a decision on what's the best thing to do for you. So the biggest component today, and I'm very happy about it, is health and longevity, right? Longevity is a nice buzzword, but health has been the big part where people are looking how to stay healthy or stay on top of their health. They've seen here in North America, their parents die on 12 medications. They didn't like that sight. Their parents were in a slow decline, and it was a hard sight to see. So they don't want to follow in the same footsteps. So they're saying, okay, well, what are the rules of health? What is the physiology I have to follow? Is it this keto diet? Is it this, the next diet? Why are the rules of health constantly changing? And the reason is they're not, but it's within, a consumer's, call it greater market. It's and the benefit that the consumer doesn't know what the real principles of health are, so that it's easier, obviously, to sell your product or to get in their kitchen shelves or whatever it is that you're trying to put forward. Um, so that's it in a simple sense. It's a service that will be able to connect you to the science, to information to help transform the direction you'd like to go, whether it's health or whether you're struggling with a health condition, colitis or cancer or, other complications. This is where Timeline Sciences comes in to be able to put forward in front of you the information that can be helpful and then take into account your biology. Do you have your unique circumstances? Because in a very, very, let's say, forward, it's very phenomenal fact that we share biological information. So we have databases in which every gene that we have information on has its own little library. And if there is something unique happening with you, well, we can pull all that information. We can pull all the information that makes you unique.
Great. So, to what extent do genetics determine our fate as humans?
That's a great question. It's the obvious answer is that the way you look, like what your nose, your skull, your how tall you can be approximately. That's an important one. Is determined by your genetics, but The big caveat here is that when we say genetics, we're talking about just the sequence, the way the code is written down. So DNA is very simple. It's like an instrument. It's like a guitar. That's the best way to think of DNA in terms of analogy. And when you play a guitar, the way you play the song is the different human being you get. Now, if you think of another animal, it's another instrument. It's like a piano, and a lion can be a saxophone. So you have different instruments to be able to describe different ways of storing potential information. But the way you play that instrument is vital to what you get. And what I mean by that is that at any point in time, if you interfere, let's say you send signals to the DNA as it's being used, because timing is everything. That's the hard part about genetic information, is that it doesn't tell me about timing in terms of your health and well-being. Meaning when you're born, you're a little baby, your genetics is identical to when you're 80 years old and when you're on your deathbed. So should you be doing the same thing from birth to death? No. But what the genetics does tell us is saying, okay, if you have some portion of you, does it function faster or slower? So for example, I have an enzyme that breaks down caffeine. My enzyme works faster than the average by a lot. So I didn't necessarily need to know that molecularly because I can have plenty of caffeinated substances and no issues, sleeping later in the evening, even if I take it quite late tonight. So this is where genetics plays a role. Okay, so you have this enzyme. However, there is something in which is the elephant in the room, and it's called adaptation. So even though my enzyme works very quickly, I still have to produce that enzyme. I still have to express that enzyme. And so if someone else produces very little, but they constantly keep consuming large amounts of caffeine, eventually their body will produce more and more. Same thing with alcohol. Alcohol is known as a very common one. The more you drink, the better you are at drinking. Now, it's terrible for your liver. You're still going to do damage to your nervous system and to lots of other portions, but you're at least able to break down that alcohol more so before being intoxicated. And so this is always what's to be considered in biology is adaptation. Going back to that initial question is, hey, how come stuff's so difficult and changing? Or you're told one thing and you're saying, toss it out. It's because you have to learn some kind of baseline so you can have comparison. But the reality is that we're constantly adapting to what we're doing. And because we're constantly adapting, we're responsive, dynamic beings. We then have to take that into account when we try and now push the envelope for something meaningful in your life. So if you actually did want to make an impact, I can't just be like, well, no, here's some theory. No. The fact is you're adapting constantly to your surroundings. And so when we talk about disease and genetics, in large portions of the planet, you're trying to be sold this story as if, oh, it's okay that you got cancer. Oh, it's okay that you got, Crohn's disease. Oh, it's okay you got colitis. Oh, it's okay you got arthritis. Those are genetic conditions. And the answer is no, that's story. That's not the science. The science is the exact opposite. The science is telling you that if there's a handful of individuals that showcase that they can reverse those scenarios through changes in simply what they're doing, what they're eating, how they're thinking, where they're going, then it showcases to you very simply that it is a matter of how you use the instrument. How are you using the DNA? And I think that's the harder conversation. That's a lot more complicated conversation, but we have to get there ASAP, as soon as possible, to talk about how is it that you're using your DNA. And to me, DNA is a fascinating topic because it really is, the superpowers that come along with a human being. Knowing how to tap into your DNA to be able to get the best expression, well, that's a part of, living the healthy or the good life. And you can say anything you want, but, when push comes to shove, when you're 60, 70, 80, your actions are going to showcase whether you know what you're talking about or not. And so those individuals I follow. I follow individuals that have showcased throughout their lifetime that they know what they're talking about, or at least that they put their best ideas forward. And I think it's okay to be wrong because even with their ideas being put forward, they're seeing still observations that are meaningful. They have measurements and experimentation that's great. And their model, their hypothesis here that we're building on is great. We can improve it further and further. And it's okay to say something that's not 100% accurate because it lets the next guy say from his point of view, hey, you know what? I see something a little bit I can add to the equation or to the greater scope of this model. So genetics, I think, is a big selling point today. It's a massive selling point, but as you know, I've worked now with hundreds of individuals. If you bring me your genetics, I can tell you fun stuff out of it. I can't tell you how much exercise you should be doing or how you can dose your exercise. I can't tell you what foods you should necessarily be eating. Though there's a few interesting, what we call nutrigenomics, a few things that say, hey, you have an enzyme or your enzymes works a certain way, therefore you might taste cilantro, as a super taster or a little bit differently. There's some interest there, but nothing that's going to be so drastic, because if there is something wrong in your genetics, and about 2%, 1 to 2%, maybe 5 in some parts of the world, depending on the area, do have something very, very different in their genome. And so, but you know that from birth. Yeah, right. You don't need a test to tell you later in life when you're 20s, 30s, or 40s. You know that from birth because that's the way that you function. That's the way you present yourself. That's why we go and test you and start looking what makes you different. And I think that's a very important thing to consider here when we talk about genetics or this personalized era, is that when you're born and you are different, you then give everyone else an opportunity to learn what that means and saying, oh, okay, this is, the scope and limitation of this part of the genome or that part of the genome. So scapegoat, it's been quite the scapegoat. Is it something that it's, worth the candle? Absolutely. Has it transformed medicine? It has not, but it has transformed the way that we do science. What we're capable of doing in a laboratory has been completely transformed because of our understanding of genetics.
Interesting. I think I learned something new from what you just said. I remember a particular point in my life while I was in university. When exams are approaching, or maybe it's a week or few days to exams, like we want to intensify our studying hours, so we want to study for more periods, and to do that, we have to stay awake in the night. So I remember that particular period, I would take caffeinated substances like coffee in the night, and it caused me to not be able to sleep very early. So I'll then get more time to study in the night. But there were some particular friends I had, so they would be like, Ezekiel, what's the secret? Why do you stay awake almost all night and you don't fall sleepy that quickly? So when I tell them the exact same caffeinated substances I take, I tell them the exact doses I take, and they take it right in front of my very eyes. So I noticed that some of them will still sleep just a few hours after taking it, while I'm able to go almost the whole night studying. And I was always wondering why. Why is it that we took the same substance yet they were still able to sleep? Is it that caffeine don't work for some people? But the way you just explained it now, it's much clearer now. So some people have enzymes like you that break caffeine faster than others. So I think that's one thing I actually took away from what you just explained. So, Daniel, tell us, what are the hallmarks of aging?
Yeah, so the hallmarks of aging, well, there's a very specific publication for it when we talk about hallmarks of aging, but it really talks about what's going on down in the cell, what's causing aging, what's driving aging, and in a short story of it, in a short version, is that the most important portion of the cell is the DNA, because that is the regenerative and the renewal portion of the cell, right? It's not the brain of the cell, it's the gonads, it's the reproductive portion of the cell. So damage to DNA, that means you have about a day or three before the cell can't replicate and produce more machinery, can't get more workers, can't get more proteins out to the front line. And so anything that's damaging your DNA is going to rapidly age you. Now, if we go down the next level, is that it's not as big of a deal because you can regenerate protein, but if your proteins are damaged, they can no longer function. That'll be a less of a hit to your aging, but still a certain level. And then the last portion is all the signaling that happens in and out of the cell, everything that's thrown out, the serotonins, the dopamines, the amino acids, the blood sugar, the ketones, all those other things, that they can fluctuate quite large amounts. and it's not as big of an effect as the proteins, and it's nowhere near as big of effect to your longevity, to your health span, as the DNA. So that's really what we're talking about, hallmarks of aging. Now, you can break it down to very specific, scientific terms, but it's very important to have that basic understanding. Hey, is this going to damage my DNA, or is this helping me repair my DNA? That's going to be some of the most important things. And so one that is very easy to speak about is iodine sufficiency. If you don't have enough iodine in your system, your DNA it's easier for your DNA to get damaged. If you have higher amounts of iodine in your system, it's harder for your DNA to get damaged from almost all sources, right? So that's what we're talking about. Vitamin C is a good example of one that helps turn on DNA repair enzymes, right? It works on the proteins to protect the DNA. So those are the hallmarks of aging. And then when we think of what are all the things that we're doing in life, the community, the fasting, the sleep, the recovery, the activities, they all function on this level. Are they helping support and clean up, at the level of the protein, the metabolite, or at the DNA? And I think it's important to have that just basic understanding. It's that simple. DNA, protein, metabolites, 1, 2, 3 in terms of severity or impact to the health of your cells. So if you think of it two ways for longevity or for health, you have the cell, but the cell has to work together in a community to give you some kind of function, heart rate, cognition, breathing. And so you have to maintain the cell so the cell can make it to 100 years old, let's say. But if they're not working together well, you could have a stroke, or you can have a cardiovascular event, something can happen. And even though the cell can make it to 100, the physiology didn't. It broke down. So those are the two parts, and I guess to break it down in having an idea of really what it takes to make it, to a healthy or maintain your health.
Great. So, what does our blood say about how our health?
Ah, yes, our blood. It's a very difficult one. Let's say the outlier here, I'll say first. So I can have 300 measurements and someone looks terrible. They have Alzheimer's, they're 90 years old, but they're 90 years old. And even though I might be able to calculate in their blood to say, hey, they're 140, 180, it doesn't mean anything at that time. It starts breaking down. So our blood has this predictive capability saying, hey, I go to the doctor. Hey, you know what? I can detect your liver is really screaming. It's working extra overtime. But, it's useful. It has great insights, and it tells you how the organs are communicating. And that's, I think, a very important thing about blood is it's this crosstalk between organs, and it gives us a window to be able to give them a value or a score of how well they're doing. And it's very challenging because what's very useful is having a baseline value. So just knowing when you're healthy, when you're at rest, where some measurements lie. And the reality is most people don't get a blood test when they're healthy. You don't know your values when you're in a healthy state. And so when you're having a problem, you might see something high, but is that what you should be targeting? Or is that your normal response in order to regenerate and heal? And I think we have a lot of this in both our science and our medical community that are a bit, reversed in the way we think. So cholesterol is a good example. You say cholesterol's high, I got a drug, you bring it down. But the reality is that the cholesterol is a resource for the cell in that is responding to a damage or an event, and it's in trying to help and heal. So knowing the interpretation here is absolutely key because it's going to guide your way of approaching your protocol or your treatment strategy. And if you're saying, well, I'm going to try and adjust the value to bring it down, you might be taking away from resources that are trying to fight and heal you. So think of it this way. You're looking from space and you see a house burning. And every single time you see a house burning, you're like, hey, wait, there's firefighters there. Now, you're not watching the firefighters get there. You're just taking snapshots and you say, no fire, hey, look, fire and firefighters. The firefighters are causing the fire. I'll send less firefighters. Let's block the firefighters from getting to the fire. And so you end up doing more harm than good in the long run because of the way you've interpreted those type of results. And so you can think of, cholesterol is one example, but there's others within our, way we approach analyzing the blood. And I think there's a very boring way in which it's communicated. It's usually communicated in ways of risk. So you might say, oh, you have a risk for, infection, a risk for arthritis, a risk for so-and-so. And that doesn't mean much to the average individual. If I say you have a 40% chance increase for risk, because I see some inflammatory markers in your blood, what does that mean for you? What do you mean a 40% increase chance? Like, am I going to get it tomorrow? Is it 5 years, 10 years? Am I not going to get it at all? Do I have to, But when we start talking about it in terms of age, saying like, hey, you have these inflammatory markers, and I know your early 30s there, but these inflammatory markers make it look like you're 55. You're like, oh, okay, I get it. All right, you're pushing me on a certain numeric, even though that numeric is a little bit of a guess. All right, it's not this guaranteed perfect thing, because again, there's only one Ezekiel on the planet, right? Like you haven't had a laboratory follow you from birth in order to be able to give you the perfect algorithm. So you're doing your best to be able to use the available information to give an estimate to saying, are you going in the right or wrong direction? And I think that's part very meaningful, not to just discard, oh, it's too hard. No, just getting in the right direction is a massive accomplishment in knowing now, okay, I have some type of feedback I can pull from, what I would say the heavy duty science, and use it to help me guide my actions, to saying, how much effort do I need to put in my life right now? Because you got to think of life as a long haul. Yeah, it's short, goes by in a blink of an eye, but what you do today is going to translate into magnitudes tomorrow. So if you put in some effort into building out your VO2 max, you're going to be more, let's say, disease proof later on in life. If you spend some time in your life practicing some type of mental exercise, you're going to be better off in terms of your cognition and cognitive decline or degeneration later in life. So when the degeneration's already happening, people look easily for give me the pill, give me the thing I can put in my mouth so this stops. When the reality is that no, you have to take action in the right direction, along with some type of, call it, support you can take orally in order to be able to get your physiology back on track. And it's a use it or lose it concept. It's an adaptation concept. If you have a degenerative lifestyle, you're going to get degeneration. There's only so much I can do from my end, or from the doctor's end. There's only so much they can do. They can support you living a degenerative lifestyle. And I think that's part getting pretty scary, because we're letting people go down and down bad rabbit holes rather than treating the actual issues, right? And I'll say, for example, diabetes. Diabetes is a really good example where we're just treating and allowing people to go down very, very disconnected lives. We're saying, you're doing something wrong. Here's a drug. Continue doing it wrong. And we won't address the underlying issue of community, of place, of purpose, because it's a psychological condition. This person is constantly doing something that's against their well-being, saying, well, yeah, you have a right to do whatever you want. Yeah, you do. In that regard, you can harm yourself, but why is the medical system supporting someone in a way in which doesn't get them to a better end result? Rather, it gives them ability to do more damage to themselves. And another one, for example, more, let's say, less harmful one, but one that's still very much so in the same idea. Someone can have heartburn because their diet is garbage and they're eating things in which is causing a lot of acid reflux, and issues for the digestive system. And you can go in and get a drug to suppress that response. So instead of addressing what you're eating and what you're putting in your system that's causing the acid reflux, that's causing the issues, you can drug the system so that it's not responsive. So you can keep eating the same things that are causing you the problem in the first place. You're trying to cancel out your body's feedback systems to telling you, hey, I don't like this. And to me, that's our medical system, or that's, I guess, the approach is going in, I think, a very wrong direction, right? I don't think that's what should be allowed. I think that is the opposite. And the reality is that in order for that person to be, hey, I'll stop putting this in my mouth, these are strong, these are a little bit more of a delicate or harder concepts, because, it comes into where's that person's emotional well-being, right? What's that individual's social network? What's happening in their life that they feel like this is their best solution of coping or dealing with, the stressors that they have. So it's a little bit long-winded answer. Maybe went down the tangent, but in all circumstances, blood gives you an excellent insight into this global picture of the body, where I don't have to take a sample of your heart or a sample of your lungs or a sample of your liver. That's not an option. Your blood, though, that is. It's easily accessible.
Great. So, tell us, what are the pillars of longevity?
Right. The pillars of longevity are very simple. I mentioned and alluded to a few of it, but you can think of the first one as an umbrella term of recovery systems. So sleep, right? If you're not sleeping well, it's going to have a massive impact to your health and longevity. It's the time where you are recovering. And if you are not able to recover, then it's a compounding effect in which we'll very quickly see problems. So you can think of the quality of sleep is massive. And individuals that used to take naps, I know it's not as popular here in North America today, but that would take a pause early in the day. It says quite a bit. It says they wake up with the sun. It says that they know how to take active rest, and that they go to sleep, let's say with the sun. And in all these circumstances, it is very much so in this notion of recovery systems. Number two, one that now again supports the way that you recover, the way you clean your blood, is fasting. So if you're eating first thing in the morning, last thing at night, it doesn't matter who you are. Even if you're eating healthy food, it's going to cause you a problem because you're not giving your body a chance to clean your blood, right? The liver has to either deal with nutrition, with whatever you're eating, or when you give it enough break, it'll start cleaning your blood. It'll redistribute the nutrition that you just ate into resources to the other organs. But if you keep sending in more and more food, it just has to keep processing it. So when we fast, this portion allows us to turn on our hormetic system, right? It is our ability to turn on hormones and signaling in such a way that makes us healthier for longer. And if you think of it this way, if you constantly need to eat, you're in a weakened state. And what do I mean by that? Well, let's say you have to go hunting or fishing. And every 2 hours they say, hey, we got to stop, man. I got to eat something. I can't go on anymore. I have to eat. You're like, God, we're never going to get there. What's wrong with this guy? Why is he so feeble that he can't make it 2 hours? And we still have like an 8-hour hike to go into the spot where we want to hunt or fish. So if versus the opposite, a certain person says, yeah, no problem. Let's get there. We'll hike and we'll eat once when we get there. And their system is strong enough, resilient enough that it can take us all the food it needs, all the energy, and redistribute it through the body, and then be good for the rest of the day. Now, I would say, and I would argue that that's how we're designed as human beings. We're not designed to constantly keep eating, right? There's a little bit of difference between man and female, and I'll speak, I guess, to the man here, but the man even more so is designed very much so to be able to go for long periods without having to constantly put stuff in their mouth. Hydration is a different story, but food in that regard. So it's interesting that the diets, when you look across the planet, they fulfill a very simple thing. Your diet must give you all the basic nutrients that you need to live. But outside of that, it's actually how and when you eat that determines your longevity. Going down, it's expensive to digest food. So the easier it is for you to digest your food, the longer you'll live. And so there's a really interesting, I don't know, this is a sensitive one because I know a lot of people have issues with alcohol, but just a tiny small amount of alcohol in different areas. So if we look at Northern Europe, Okinawa, Japan, Hunza Valley, Afghanistan, every culture has a distilled liquor. Now they only consume a tiny amount, and it's usually in a community setting with a meal. So it's like a digestive. And this idea of digestion goes a very long way in biology because, one, it's expensive. That's the best way to think of it. If you're constantly asking your system to secrete and produce digestive enzymes, you're going through your cookie jar of life faster. And then going down, we see the next as a big pillar is going to be cold and heat exposure, and cold more so than heat. So when we take a look at the cultures that make it to 100, a lot of them have this type of either sauna or cold exposure as part of their health regime. And so we know an incredible amount of what happens on the blood, the molecular level when we expose ourselves to these thermo modalities. And it's very interesting because when we think of mood and we think of these, these experiences of life, we don't necessarily associate them with temperature, but the enzyme used for your synapse, for your brain to be able to secrete dopamine for your reward system, it functions at a narrow range of temperature. And so the more the thermostable that the protein is, the more that you experience its emotional stability, the more that you experience emotional resilience, the more that you experience mental clarity. So these very much so sought after, health or physiological outcomes are tied in with something as basic as temperature. And so us exposing ourselves to a little bit of the, call it the ends of the spectrum, or the little bit of the extremes, where we're going into cold, where we have to engage our body so that we rise to the challenge of the cold or rise to the challenge of the heat, where we're sitting there, we're sweating, our heart rate's up, but we're focused, we're with our body. We're not that guy that passes out in the sauna. Don't be that guy. And it allows us to be able to overcome that stress, to work with that stress in order to become stronger, right? Either you marvel in stress and you become stronger, or you crumble and, you learn to pick yourself up again. So that thermostability, the temperature part is massive for longevity. And then the last part, and possibly the most important, is going to be a temperament, right? Your mindset of how you engage in life. Do you have a very laissez-faire mindset? Are you grumpy? Are you just an asshole? There isn't anybody that I've met that is a centenarian or a centurion, a person that makes it 100 years old and is a miserable prick. Let's be honest. That is not the recipe to make it to 100 years old. Rather, that mindset is really a trickle down of how the rest of your biology functions. What you believe determines of what your perceptions and what your reality is. And so that mindset goes a long way. That mindset is connected to community. That mindset is connected to the way that you hold or let go of grudges, right? And so I think almost in all doctrines, all call it religious, theological doctrines, there is a do not fear. There is a forgive your neighbor, show love to your enemy. There's these concepts that circulate, and it's because that's what gives the human being some freedom. And clearly from the biological side of studying health and longevity, it works well with your system, right? If you're the one that's harboring resentment towards, hey, I'm not forgiving somebody for something, it's not absolving them, but it's holding on to it. You're the person that's stuck with that. Like, you're carrying it around, and it's easier if you let it go. It's better for you if you let those things go. And so there's, I have some heavy duty, call it studies and data, to be able to separate out what types of temperament, what types of mindsets do better and worse. And obviously, you can't predict all of them, but the worst case ones are ones in which someone is isolated and alone. So if someone experiencing some kind of terrible event, but they have nobody to connect to, those are some of the worst, call it, outcomes for temperament. And so knowing that there is someone to reach out to, knowing that there is someone to have a conversation with, even if bad things happened, they don't stand in the nervous system. They don't linger around as trauma that will, let's say, really derail the person's life. And so these are some of the very difficult ways that is to talk about from science perspectives. It's hard to bring empirical evidence, but it's more and more coming to the forefront, this understanding, this really view of, okay, how do we get at this big monster that is mindset, that is temperament, that is the way that we perceive, that is the beliefs that we hold. They're really showcasing now as to what they call it, the worst are and what the best are.
That was amazing. So, finally, tell us, what does innovation mean to you, and how does it relate to your field?
Innovation. I think innovation is having the courage of really you being unique, whatever it is that you're passionate about. It doesn't matter what it is just to go and engage in that, bring your personality out to the world, because if you don't, we all miss out. And so it might seem silly in whatever area that you're excited about, but you will innovate to some regard. That's something I think that is a basic skill set of a human being. It's part of us. It's fundamental, I should say, not necessarily basic, but I mean one and the same. And so the more you engage in with what you're passionate about, the more you're going to bring out something that somebody else, I guarantee, will also get excited about. And when we shift to that, let's say, portion in our life where we find whatever topic it is that you explored and brought forward, then we get to enjoy the innovation that you've brought to the table, right? Just by putting your attention, your time, your efforts into something, you will move it in a direction in which will make it all the more interesting for the rest of us. I think it's absolutely vital that you don't get distracted and sidetracked, and that you do engage in what you're most passionate about, because that makes it all the more worth living for the rest of us.
Wonderful. So tell us, where can listeners reach you or learn more about your work?
You can find me at timelinesciences.com, and it's just me. You can get in contact with me. That's the best way to get in contact with me. Happy to help in any way I can. I do have the socials, Instagram and Twitter or X in the same tag, Timeline Sciences. And I'm more than happy to connect with you and put you on the path to transform for the better.
Great. So it's been a really wonderful conversation with you, Daniel, and I'm really excited to host you on the Fairy Cast today.
Zico, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for the wonderful questions, and God bless to everyone over there.